You let him drive out there and my boy dies. Do you understand me? He dies." The rich man's voice tore through the firehouse like a gunshot, and every head turned. Snow was coming down so hard, the windows had gone white. The radio crackled with nothing but static. Somewhere out in that storm, a 10-year-old boy was running out of time, and the only man willing to drive into the worst blizzard in 50 years was the one stranger this whole town had spent 3 years looking down on. His name was Wade Foster. They called him a drifter, a nobody, a man with a past he wouldn't talk about. By morning, they would call him something else entirely. Let me tell you how it happened. There are towns in this country so small and so high up in the mountains that winter doesn't visit them. It moves in and takes over, like a relative who came for the holidays and never left. Cedar Falls was one of those towns. Tucked into a fold of the Rockies, population 1,100 and shrinking, Cedar Falls was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where the same 40 families had run things for 100 years, and where a man could live for 3 full winters and still be called the new fellow. That was what they called Wade Foster, the new fellow, even after 3 years. Wade was 50 years old, built like a man who had done hard work his whole life, with a quiet way about him, and eyes that always seemed to be watching the sky, watching the weather, the way some men can't stop doing once it's been their business. He had shown up in Cedar Falls one September with a battered pickup truck, a 10-year-old daughter in the passenger seat, and almost nothing else. He'd taken the one job nobody local wanted, driving the town's single snowplow through the long, brutal nights of winter, keeping the mountain roads open so the school bus could run and the ambulance could get through. He lived in a small rented house on the very edge of town, where the streetlights gave out and the forest began. He kept to himself. He paid his bills in cash and on time, and in 3 years, not one soul in Cedar Falls could tell you a single true thing about where Wade Foster had come from, or why. That, of course, was the problem, because a town that doesn't know your story will go ahead and write one for you. And the story Cedar Falls had written about Wade Foster was not a kind one. "He's running from something," they said in the diner. "A man doesn't show up out of nowhere with no past unless he's hiding one. Keep your kids away from that house on the edge of town. There's something not right about a man that quiet." They had no proof of anything. They didn't need any. Suspicion, in a small town, doesn't run on proof. It runs on the comfort of having someone to look down on. And the family that looked down the hardest was the Crawfords. The Crawfords had owned the lumber mill in Cedar Falls for 4 generations, which in a town that size made them something close to royalty. Garrett Crawford was the current king of it, a big, confident man in his 50s who wore his prosperity like a warm coat and believed, deep in his bones, that a man's worth could be measured by his bank account and his bloodline. Garrett Crawford had decided, without ever once speaking to him, that Wade Foster was beneath his notice. And what a man like Garrett believes, his whole household tends to believe too. Which brings us to the children. Wade's daughter was named Hannah. She was 10 years old, with her father's quiet watchfulness and her late mother's gentle heart, though Wade rarely spoke of her mother, and Hannah had learned not to ask. She was a sweet, shy girl who loved animals and books and drawing pictures of mountains, and she wanted, more than anything in the world, to be liked. The Crawford boy was named Tyler. He was 11, and he had learned from his father exactly how the world was sorted into people who mattered and people who didn't. And Tyler Crawford had decided that the quiet new girl whose dad drove the snowplow belonged in the second pile. It started small, the way cruelty between children always does. A whisper, a turned back, a seat saved for everyone but her. But it grew, the way these things grow when the adults aren't looking, until poor Hannah Foster spent her recesses alone against the brick wall of the schoolhouse, drawing her mountains, pretending she didn't hear the things they said. There was one afternoon in particular. The class was choosing partners for a winter project, and the teacher had stepped out of the room, and Hannah sat with her hands folded and her heart pounding the way it always did at moments like this, hoping, just hoping, that someone would turn to her. And Tyler Crawford had stood up at the front of the room and said, loud enough for everyone, "Whatever you do, don't pick the plow girl. My dad says her dad's running from the law. They could leave town any night. And the whole class had laughed, and Hannah Foster had looked down at her desk and drawn a single straight line across her mountains, hard enough to tear the paper, and said nothing at all. She had wanted to tell them her father was the gentlest man alive. She had wanted to tell them he sang to her when she was scared, and could name every star over their house. But she had learned that some things, once a town decides them, cannot be argued with by a 10-year-old girl. So she folded the torn drawing into her pocket and carried it home, and never showed her father, because she could not bear for him to know. She never told her father. She was afraid it would hurt him, and Hannah Foster had already learned, young as she was, that her father carried some hurt she couldn't see, that there were nights he sat alone at the kitchen table long after she'd gone to bed, looking at an old photograph he kept in his wallet, and that on those nights, his eyes were far away in a place she wasn't allowed to follow. So she kept her own hurt to herself, and the two of them, father and daughter, loved each other across a small kitchen table in a small house on the edge of town, each one quietly carrying a weight to spare the other. That was the Fosters, before the storm. I'm going to tell you Wade Foster's secret now, even though the people of Cedar Falls wouldn't learn it until that terrible night. I'm telling you because I want you to understand exactly what kind of man was living quietly on the edge of their town while they whispered about him in the diner. 3 years before, in a city 400 miles away, Wade Foster had not been a snowplow driver. He had been the captain of a mountain search and rescue team, one of the best in the country. For 20 years, when a hiker went missing on a ridge, or an avalanche buried a backcountry skier, or a child wandered off into the wilderness, Wade Foster was the man they called. He had pulled more people back from the edge of death than he could count. He had a wall full of commendations, and a reputation that ran the length of the mountains. He also had a wife. Her name was Claire, and she worked the rescue team right beside him, a paramedic, fearless, the steady hand to his steady nerve. They had married young, raised Hannah on the edge of the wilderness, and built a life around the simple, dangerous, beautiful work of saving people who could not save themselves. And then came the day that broke him. There had been a flash flood, a wall of water down a canyon where a tour group had been caught. Wade led the rescue, and partway through that long, desperate day, he had to make a choice no human being should ever have to make. 2 groups of people trapped, the water rising, time enough to reach only one before the canyon filled. A leader's choice, the kind of choice that has no right answer, only different people who live, and different people who don't. Wade made the call he believed would save the most lives, and it did. But Claire, his Claire, had gone after the other group on her own, refusing to leave them, certain she could reach them in time. The water took her. Wade Foster saved 11 people that day. The newspapers did not write about the 11. They wrote about the one, the paramedic who died, the wife of the captain who chose to send his team the other way. They did not understand the choice. They did not understand the water. They printed his name beside the word blame, and a town that had once called him a hero decided, almost overnight, that they had been wrong about him. What the newspapers never printed, what no one ever asked him, was the last thing Claire had said to him over the radio, in the final seconds before the water took her. She had not been angry. She had not been afraid. She had said, "I've got them, Wade. I've got them. Tell Hannah I." And then the radio had gone to static, and the canyon had filled, and the rest of that sentence had become the silence Wade Foster carried with him every single day. He had spent 3 years certain that the unfinished sentence was an accusation. It would take a second storm, and a second impossible choice, before he finally understood it had been something else entirely. He could have fought the newspapers. He had the truth on his side. But Wade Foster was a man with a grief too big for fighting, and a 10-year-old daughter who had just lost her mother, and one single thought clear in all the noise: get her somewhere clean, somewhere nobody knows, somewhere we can just be quiet and small and start again. So he packed a battered pickup truck, took his daughter's hand, and drove until the mountains hid them. He took the quietest job he could find, in the quietest town he could find, and he made himself small, and he told no one his story. Not because he was hiding a crime, but because he was hiding a wound. That was the secret of the man on the edge of town. Not that he had something to be ashamed of, that he had given everything, and been blamed for it, and simply did not have the strength to be a hero ever again. He just wanted to keep his daughter safe, plow the roads, and be left alone. The mountain, of course, had other plans. It was the second week of January when Wade Foster first felt it. He was the kind of man who could read a sky the way other people read a newspaper, and on that Tuesday morning, standing in his driveway with a cup of black coffee going cold in his hand, he read something in the clouds over the western ridge that made the back of his neck go cold. The clouds were stacked too high and moving too strange. The air had a flat, heavy stillness to it, the kind of quiet that isn't peace, but warning. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees overnight, and the wind had died to nothing. And Wade Foster knew, the way you know a thing in your gut before your head can explain it, that something enormous was coming down off that mountain. He drove into town that morning and did something he almost never did. He spoke up. He went to the county offices and found the man in charge of emergency services, a decent but overwhelmed fellow named Pete Halloran, and he told him plainly, "There's a storm coming off that ridge unlike anything you've had in years. Maybe in 50 years. You need to warn people now. Get the elderly checked on, get supplies out, and for the love of God, make sure that road to the regional hospital stays clear, because in 3 days, nobody's getting down this mountain at all." Pete Halloran listened politely, but you have to understand how it looked. The town drifter, the quiet stranger nobody trusted, walking into the county office to announce that doom was coming off the mountain. The forecast from the city said snow, sure, a good amount of it, but nothing historic. And here was Wade Foster, talking like a prophet. "We appreciate it, Wade," Pete said, in the careful voice people use for someone they've decided is a little strange. "We'll keep an eye on it." They did not keep an eye on it. Garrett Crawford heard about Wade's visit by noon, and he had a fine time with it at the diner. "Now the plowman's a weatherman," he laughed, and the other men laughed with him. "Next he'll be telling us the end is nigh. 3 years and the fellow finally finds something to say, and it's a fairy tale about the sky falling." The whole town had a chuckle at the strange quiet man who thought he could read the heavens. And Wade Foster went home, and he did the only thing left to him. He prepared his own house. He stocked wood and water and food. He checked over the town's snowplow from end to end, greased every fitting, filled every tank, and made sure the chains on its great tires were sound. He couldn't make the town listen. But when the mountain came down, he intended to be ready. It began on Thursday night, just as Wade had said it would, and it began gently, fat, soft flakes drifting down out of a darkening sky, the kind of snow that makes children press their faces to the window. By midnight, it was no longer gentle. The wind came first, roaring down off the ridge like something alive, and it drove the snow before it in great white sheets that erased the world. The temperature plunged. Power lines, heavy with ice, began to snap one after another, and by 2 in the morning the whole of Cedar Falls had gone dark and cold. By dawn on Friday, there was no dawn to speak of, only a gray, screaming half-light and snow already piled to the windowsills. And it did not stop. It did not stop on Friday, and it did not stop Friday night. The radio, for those who had battery-powered ones, carried frantic updates from the regional station. Historic storm, 50-year event, all roads closed, do not travel under any circumstances. The very thing Wade Foster had stood in the county office and predicted, while the town laughed. Nobody was laughing now. By Saturday morning, Cedar Falls was buried and blind, and entirely cut off from the rest of the world. The phones were down. The cell towers were down. The mountain road that was the town's only artery to the hospital and the valley below had vanished completely beneath drifts taller than a man. And out in that white roaring nothing, the only thing moving was a single snowplow. Wade Foster had been driving for 30 hours. He drove because it was his job, but more than that, he drove because he understood what the others were only beginning to learn, that in a storm like this, an open road was the line between life and death, and the man behind the plow was holding that line for every soul in town. He cleared the road to the clinic. He cleared the way to the homes of the elderly he'd quietly noted on his map weeks before. He plowed out the volunteer firehouse, where Pete Halloran and a handful of exhausted men had set up a command post and a warming shelter for families whose homes had lost heat. He did not stop to be thanked. He did not stop at all. He drank coffee from a thermos, kept the heater of the old plow truck running, and pushed back the mountain one pass at a time, a single stubborn man against 50 years of snow. There is a thing worth saying here, because it is the quiet center of who Wade Foster was. Nobody asked him to check on the elderly. Nobody asked him to memorize, weeks before the storm, which houses on the edge of town held people who lived alone. The widow on Pine Street who couldn't manage her own woodpile, the old veteran past the bridge whose son had moved away, the couple on the hill in their 90s. But Wade had noted every one of them, the way a rescue captain notes the weak points in a mountain. And when the storm came down, he went to each of them in turn, in the worst of the night, and dug out their doors and checked their stoves and left them wood within reach, and said almost nothing, and moved on. They would not learn until later that the strange, quiet plowman had likely saved their lives in the dark while the rest of the town slept. He did it because it was simply what he was, a man who could not drive past someone in danger if there was breath in his body to help them. The town had called that quietness suspicious. The truth was that it had been watchful all along, and the difference between those two words was the difference between the story Cedar Falls told and the story that was true. And then, late on Saturday afternoon, as the light was failing and the storm was howling its worst, a boy named Tyler Crawford collapsed. Here is the thing about a town when the lights go out. All the things that divided it, the money, the bloodlines, the old grudges, the careful sorting of people into those who matter and those who don't, all of it had gathered, by Saturday afternoon, into the cold concrete shelter of the volunteer firehouse. Because when your own home goes dark and the temperature drops below zero, pride is the first thing you leave behind. 40 families crowded together under emergency blankets in the glow of a few battery lanterns, and among them, near the back, sat the Crawfords. Even Garrett Crawford, king of the lumber mill, had brought his family to shelter with everyone else. He sat stiffly, a man unused to needing anyone, with his wife beside him and his son Tyler bundled in a blanket at his feet. And it was there, on the cold floor of that firehouse, that Tyler Crawford began to die. The boy had been pale and tired all day, and his parents had thought it was just the cold, the fear, the strangeness of it all. But now he was worse, much worse. He was breathing too fast, and his skin had gone clammy and gray. And when his mother shook him, his eyes rolled and would not focus. He was slipping into something deep and dangerous, and his mother's scream brought the whole shelter to its feet. There was no doctor. The town's one physician was trapped on the far side of the mountain, on the wrong side of the storm. But there was a retired nurse among them, a sharp old woman named Edith, and she dropped to her knees beside the boy and put her hands on him, and her ear to his chest, and her face, in the lantern light, went very still. "This isn't the cold," she said. "His body's poisoning itself." "I've seen this before. It's his blood sugar, gone wild. Diabetes, undiagnosed most likely. The stress, the cold, no food. It's pushed him into a crisis." She looked up, and there was no comfort in her old eyes. "He needs a hospital. He needs fluids and insulin and a doctor, and he needs them tonight. By morning, it will be too late." The words fell into the firehouse like stones into a well. The hospital was 40 miles down a mountain road that no longer existed. There was no ambulance that could move. No helicopter could fly in that storm. No phone could call for help that could not come. Garrett Crawford, the big confident man who had spent his whole life certain that money and bloodline could solve any problem, knelt on the concrete floor beside his dying son and discovered, for the first time in his life, that he was utterly powerless. "Somebody do something," he roared, and his voice cracked in the middle of it, and it was no longer the voice of a king, it was the voice of a frightened father. "Somebody, there has to be, somebody do something." And in the silence that followed, the door of the firehouse opened with a blast of wind and snow, and a tired man in a snow-crusted coat stepped inside to refill his thermos. Wade Foster. For a moment, Wade didn't understand the scene in front of him. The crowd, the lanterns, the woman on her knees, the boy on the floor. Then Edith the nurse looked up and saw him, and something passed across her face, because Edith was old enough and wise enough to have always suspected there was more to the quiet plowman than the town allowed. "Wade," she said, "this boy is going to die without a hospital, tonight. Is there any way at all, to get him down the mountain?" The whole firehouse turned to look at him, and Wade Foster stood there, snow melting off his coat, and felt the old thing rise up in him, the thing he had buried 3 years ago in a flooded canyon, the thing he had run 400 miles to escape, the voice in his head that had once made him the best rescue captain in the mountains, now waking up, taking the measure of the storm, calculating the impossible. Down the mountain road, in the dark, in the worst storm in 50 years, with drifts taller than the truck and ice under the snow, and 100 ways to slide off the edge into nothing. It could not be done. And yet, the plow could break the drifts, if its engine held. The road, he knew by heart, every curve of it, 3 years of plowing burned into his memory. The boy could ride in the cab where the heater ran. It was not impossible. It was only nearly impossible, which to a man who had spent 20 years doing the nearly impossible was a different thing entirely. But here is the part I want you to sit with, because it is the truth at the heart of this whole story. It was Garrett Crawford's son. The son of the man who had laughed at him in the diner. The son of the family who had decided Wade was beneath them. The boy, and Wade knew this, because Hannah had finally told him one night, weeping, who had led the cruelty against his daughter, who had made her stand alone against the schoolhouse wall. If ever a man had reason to say no, to say let your money save him, let your bloodline save him, I'm just the drifter you laughed at, Wade Foster had that reason, tenfold. And Garrett Crawford knew it. That was the worst of it. The big man looked up from the floor at the stranger he had scorned, and the understanding broke across his face, and his pride collapsed entirely. He simply broke. He did not offer money. He simply broke. "Please," Garrett Crawford whispered to the man he had spent 3 years looking down on. "Please. He's my boy. He's all please." And Wade Foster looked at the dying child, and looked at the broken father, and made the choice that defined him. The same choice he had always made, the one that had cost him everything, and would have cost him everything again, because it was simply who he was underneath all the quiet and all the hiding. "Get him in the truck," Wade said. "Wrap him warm. We don't have long." That was the moment the firehouse erupted, the moment Garrett Crawford's wife sobbed, and a different voice cut through it all, the voice from the very start of this story. "You let him drive out there and my boy dies. Do you understand me? He dies." It was Garrett, turning on Pete Halloran in a fury of terror, unable to bear the helplessness, lashing out the way frightened people do. "You're going to send my son into that? With him? A man we don't know? A man who—" And Wade Foster, already turning toward the door, stopped. He turned back, and for the first time in 3 years, the quiet man let the whole town see his eyes. Not cold, not strange, just steady, terribly, deeply steady, the eyes of a man who had stared down death more times than any of them would in 10 lifetimes. "Mr. Crawford," Wade said quietly, and the whole room went silent to hear him. "You don't know one true thing about me. You decided what I was 3 years ago, and you never once looked closer. That's all right. You don't have to know me. You just have to decide, right now, whether you want your boy to have a chance, or whether your fear is worth more to you than his life. Because I am walking out that door in 60 seconds, and the only question is whether your son is in the truck when I do." The silence held for 1 heartbeat. 2. Then Garrett Crawford bent down and gathered his son into his arms and carried him out into the storm, to the cab of the snowplow, and laid him on the seat, and stepped back. And he looked at Wade Foster with an expression no one in Cedar Falls had ever seen on that proud man's face. "Bring him back," Garrett said. "Please, bring my boy back." "I'll bring him back," Wade said. He climbed into the cab. Edith the nurse climbed in beside the boy, refusing to be left behind, and a small figure pushed through the crowd at the last second. Hannah, his Hannah, her face white with fear. Daddy. Wade leaned out and took her face in his cold hands. Stay with Miss Edith's sister. Stay warm. I'll be back by morning. He paused, and something passed between them, some understanding deeper than her 10 years. I have to do this, Hannah. You know I do. And Hannah Foster, who knew her father better than anyone alive, nodded through her tears, because she did know. She had always known there was more to him than the town could see. Come back, Daddy, she whispered. Always, he said. Then the great engine of the snowplow roared, and the headlights cut 2 narrow tunnels into the screaming white, and Wade Foster drove out of the safe glow of the firehouse and into the worst storm in 50 years, carrying the son of his enemy down an impossible mountain. I cannot tell you that drive was anything but a war. For 6 hours, Wade Foster fought the mountain for every single foot of road. The snow came at the windshield so thick, the headlights showed nothing but a wall of white, and he drove by memory and by feel, knowing each curve before he reached it, sensing the edge of the road, where a wrong move meant a long fall into the dark. Again and again the plow slammed into drifts that buried the hood, and again the great blade chewed through them, the engine screaming, while Wade worked the controls with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that panic kills and steadiness saves. Beside him, old Edith held the Crawford boy and watched him with a nurse's trained eye, calling out his breathing, his color, the flutter of his pulse. The boy drifted in and out, sometimes murmuring, sometimes terribly still, and each time he went still, Edith would say, "Wade," in a tight voice, and Wade would answer, without taking his eyes from the white, I know, we're moving. Keep him warm. Talk to him. Tell him about summer." Twice the plow nearly went off the road. Once, on a switchback where the wind had scoured the snow into ice, the great machine began to slide sideways toward the edge, and the long, dark drop, and for 3 eternal seconds it hung there, and Edith stopped breathing, and Wade Foster did something with the blade and the wheel that no ordinary driver would have thought of, dropping the plow to catch the ground like an anchor, and the truck shuddered and held and slowly came back from the edge. "How?" Edith breathed. "Did you know to do that?" And Wade Foster, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes on the storm, said the thing that finally told her who he really was. "I've been doing this my whole life," he said quietly, "just not with a plow." And Edith, who was wise, asked no more. There was a moment, near the worst of it, the boy gone silent, the road gone invisible, the engine straining, when Wade Foster felt the old grief reach up for him out of the dark, the flood, the canyon, Claire going into the water, the voice that had whispered to him for 3 years, "You couldn't save her. You can't save anyone. You have no right to try again." And then a small voice from the seat beside him, the Crawford boy surfacing for a moment from the deep, murmured, "Is my dad coming?" And Wade Foster heard, in that frightened child's voice, every person he had ever pulled back from the edge. He heard the 11 he saved in the canyon. He heard his own daughter saying, "Come back, Daddy." And then, at last, after 3 years of silence, he heard the rest of Claire's unfinished sentence. Heard it the way you finally hear a thing when your heart is ready, and not one moment before. "Tell Hannah I went in for them. Tell Hannah I'd do it again. Tell Hannah that's what we're for." It had never been an accusation. It had been a blessing. It had been his brave wife, in her last seconds, telling him not to carry her death as a guilt, but to carry her courage as a torch. And the grief loosened its grip, all at once, because Wade Foster understood at last the thing the storm had come to teach him. He had not failed Claire. Claire had made her own brave choice, the same kind of choice he would have made, the same kind of choice he was making right now. Loving someone enough to go into the water for them was not a sin to be punished. It was the finest thing a person could do, and running from that, hiding from it, burying it, was the only real way to dishonor her. "Yeah, son," Wade said softly to the dying boy. "Your dad's waiting for you. We're almost there. Just hold on a little longer." He drove the last miles like a man who had set down something he'd been carrying for far too long. The road dropped, and the worst of the wind fell away behind the shoulder of the mountain, and the snow thinned from a wall to a curtain, and then, blurred and golden through the falling flakes, the most beautiful thing Wade Foster had seen in 3 years. The lights of the regional hospital appeared at last at the bottom of the mountain. He brought the boy in through the emergency doors at a little after midnight, carrying him in his own arms because there was no time to wait for a gurney. Snow falling off both of them, Edith shouting the boy's symptoms to the rushing doctors, and the hospital, which had a generator and insulin, and a team of people who knew exactly what to do, took Tyler Crawford and went to work. Wade Foster stood in the waiting room, soaked and shaking and hollowed out, and waited. An hour later, a doctor came out, pulling down her mask, and found the exhausted man by the window. "Are you the one who brought him?" "Yes." "Through that?" She gestured at the windows, at the storm still raging. "Down the mountain road, tonight?" "Yes." The doctor looked at him for a long moment, the way people look at a thing they can't quite believe is real. "Mister," she said, "I don't know who you are, but you need to understand something. Another hour, even another half hour, and there would have been nothing we could do. That boy was at the very edge. You didn't just give him a ride." She shook her head slowly. "You reached into the grave and pulled him back out. He's going to live, because of you." Wade Foster sat down in a plastic waiting room chair, put his face in his weathered hands, and for the first time in 3 years, the captain of the rescue team allowed himself to weep. Not for grief this time, but for something that felt, after so long, almost like being healed. The storm broke on Sunday, the way even the worst storms finally do, and the sun came up over a buried, gleaming, silent Cedar Falls. And as the town dug itself out, the story spread from house to house faster than any plow could clear a road. The drifter saved the Crawford boy. The stranger they'd laughed at had driven into the heart of the storm, the very storm he had warned them about and they had mocked, and carried a dying child down an impossible mountain and brought him back to life. And then came the rest of it, because old Edith the nurse had heard, "I've been doing this my whole life, just not with a plow." And Edith had a phone and a niece in the city, and a powerful curiosity, and within 2 days, the whole truth of Wade Foster had come home to Cedar Falls. They learned about the rescue team, the 20 years, the wall of commendations, the hundreds of lives, and they learned about the canyon, and the flood, and the impossible choice, and Claire, brave Claire, going into the water to save the ones no one else could reach. They learned that the man they had decided was a nobody hiding from his shame was in truth a hero hiding from his grief. And Cedar Falls was ashamed. The shame did not stay private, the way shame so often does. On the first Sunday after the roads were clear, the town gathered in the church at the center of Cedar Falls, the way mountain towns have always gathered when something too large for a single household has happened to all of them at once. And old Edith the nurse, who had ridden down the mountain in that cab and seen what she had seen, stood up without being asked, and told the whole congregation, in her plain and trembling voice, exactly what Wade Foster had done. She told them about the switchback where the truck had nearly gone over the edge, and the thing he'd done with the blade that no ordinary man would have known to do, and the way he'd talked to a dying child for 6 hours in the dark to keep him in this world. And when she was done, she said one more thing, and it landed on that town like a verdict. "We have spent 3 years," Edith said, "deciding that a man was less than us because he was quiet and poor and would not hand us his sorrows to gossip over. We told ourselves a story about him because it was easier than knocking on his door and learning the truth. And the truth, when it came, did not come gently. It came at midnight, in the worst storm of our lives, in the body of a child who would be in the ground this morning if that man had been the kind of man we said he was." She looked around the silent church. "I am 81 years old and I am ashamed of myself, and I will not be too proud to say so out loud. I hope I am not the only one." She was not the only one. One by one that morning, the people of Cedar Falls stood up. You have to understand, these were not bad people. They were ordinary people, which is a different thing, capable of ordinary cruelty and, when shown the truth, capable of ordinary grace. And to their credit, to the real and lasting credit of that small mountain town, when they understood what they had done, and what Wade Foster had done in return for it, they did not look away. It was Garrett Crawford who came first. He came to the small house on the edge of town, the proud man humbled to the ground, and he stood on Wade Foster's porch with his hat in his hands like a boy, and he could barely get the words out. "I laughed at you," Garrett said. "In the diner, when you tried to warn us. I called you names you never earned. I let my son treat your daughter in a way that shames me to my soul, and then I knelt on that floor and begged you, to do the one thing I had spent 3 years telling everyone you weren't good enough to do." His voice broke. "You had every reason on God's earth to say no. And you didn't even pause. You saved my boy, the boy who hurt your girl. You saved him without a second's hesitation." He looked up, his eyes wet. "What kind of man does that? What kind of man have I been too blind and too proud to see?" And Wade Foster, who had learned something on that mountain about forgiveness, both giving it and accepting it, put his hand on the broken man's shoulder. "The kind of man who knows what it is to lose someone he loves," Wade said quietly. "I wasn't going to let you find out. Not if I could help it. Not for anything in the world." Garrett Crawford wept on that porch, and the two men, the king and the stranger, stood together in the snow as something old and ugly melted away between them. Now we come to the reward. And I want to be honest with you, because Wade Foster would want me to be. There was no fortune. The Crawfords were rich, and they offered. Of course they offered. Garrett Crawford tried to put a check in Wade's hand that would have changed his life, and Wade folded it shut and gave it back. "I didn't drive down that mountain for money," he said. "If I'd wanted to be paid for saving lives, I'd never have stopped doing the job I trained for. Keep it. Put it towards something good. Because the thing Wade Foster needed, no check could buy." The thing Wade Foster needed was the thing he had lost in that canyon 3 years before, and had been starving for ever since, in his small house on the edge of town, watched and whispered about, and never once welcomed. He needed to belong somewhere. And that, in the end, is exactly what Cedar Falls gave him. It started with the children. Tyler Crawford came home from the hospital a changed boy, the way a child is changed by coming close to the dark and being carried back. The first thing he did, the very first thing, before he even fully had his strength back, was to walk across the schoolyard to where Hannah Foster stood alone against the brick wall, drawing her mountains, and to sit down beside her in front of everyone, and to say, "Your dad saved my life, and I was awful to you. I'm so sorry. Can I see your drawings?" Children forgive faster than grown-ups, and mean faster, and mend faster too. By spring, Hannah Foster was no longer the girl against the wall. She was simply one of the kids of Cedar Falls, included, invited, at last allowed to belong. And the sight of his daughter laughing in a crowd of friends did more for Wade Foster's healing than any commendation ever had. Then came the grown-ups. The diner that had laughed at him now fell silent and respectful when he walked in, and then, slowly, warm. Men who had whispered about him for 3 years now nodded to him, and then shook his hand, and then, one fine morning, slid over to make room for him at the counter and asked his opinion on the weather, which Wade Foster, it turned out, was very glad to give. But the truest gift came from Pete Halloran, the emergency man, on behalf of the whole county. Cedar Falls, and the towns around it, had no real search and rescue team. They had always relied on help from the valley, help that in a storm like the one they'd just survived could not come in time. The storm had taught them, in the hardest way, exactly how alone they were on their mountain, and exactly what it meant to have a man among them who knew how to save people. So Pete Halloran came to Wade Foster with a proposal, and behind it stood the whole town. "We want to build a mountain rescue team," Pete said. "A real one, for Cedar Falls and every town up here, and there's not a soul in 100 miles qualified to lead it." He paused. "Except one. We'd be honored, Wade, more than honored. Would you teach us? Would you lead us? Would you do the thing you were born to do, right here, with us?" And Wade Foster, who had run 400 miles to stop being a hero, who had buried his calling in a flooded canyon, who had spent 3 years as the stranger on the edge of town, stood among the people who had once judged him and now claimed him as their own, and felt the last of the cold 3 years finally leave his bones. He thought of Claire. He thought of what she would say. The Lord didn't give you those hands so you could drive a plow, Wade Foster. Now go on. Go do what you're for. Yes, Wade said. I'll lead it. I'll teach you everything I know. A year later, on a bright cold morning in early winter, the people of Cedar Falls gathered at the firehouse, the same firehouse where a boy had nearly died on a concrete floor, for the dedication of the new Cedar Falls Mountain Rescue Station. It was a fine building, built partly with a large and quiet donation from the Crawford family, the check Wade had refused finding its way at last toward something good. On the wall inside hung a single framed photograph that Wade had finally taken out of his wallet and set where the light could reach it. A woman with kind eyes and a fearless smile, in a rescue jacket, standing on a ridge. Underneath it, a small brass plate read, Claire Foster. She went into the water for others. We honor her by doing the same. Wade Foster stood at the front, in a new jacket, with the Cedar Falls rescue patch on the shoulder, the captain once more, surrounded by a team of volunteers he had trained through a long autumn, ordinary men and women of the town who had learned, under his patient teaching, how to save a life. Among them, grinning, stood a teenage boy who had asked to join the very week he was old enough, Tyler Crawford, who had decided what he wanted to do with the life that had been given back to him. And in the front row stood Hannah Foster, 11 now, no longer alone, surrounded by friends, watching her father with shining eyes. Garrett Crawford spoke. He, who had once mocked Wade Foster in the diner, now stood before the whole town and told the truth about the kind of man he'd been and the kind of man Wade was, and asked the town to remember the lesson the storm had taught them, that you never, ever know the worth of a soul by the size of his bank account or the mystery of his past, and that the quietest man on the edge of town may be carrying a greatness you are too proud to see. Then Wade Foster said a few words. He wasn't much for speeches. He thanked them for the welcome that had healed him. He spoke about his wife and what she had taught him about going into the water, and he ended with the only thing he really wanted to say. I came here to disappear, Wade said, looking out at the faces of the town that had once judged him and now loved him. I came here to be nobody, in nowhere, where nothing would ever ask anything of me again. And you, every one of you, you wouldn't let me. You needed me. And it turns out that being needed, being a part of something, belonging to a place and to people who'll have you, that's not the burden I thought it was. He looked at his daughter, and then at the photograph on the wall. That's the whole reason we're here. And the people of Cedar Falls, who had learned the truth the hard way and become better for it, rose to their feet and welcomed home the stranger they had once turned away, the quiet man on the edge of town, who, when the worst storm in 50 years came down off the mountain, was the only one with the courage to drive into it. He had given everything, once, and been blamed for it. And life, in its own slow and stubborn and merciful way, had given it all back.